Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with James Gilligan and David A.J. Richards with Marcia to discuss Holding a Mirror Up to Nature, Shame, Guilt, and Violence in Shakespeare, published by our friends at Cambridge University Press. James Gilligan is a professor of clinical psychiatry at New York University who wrote Violence, Preventing Violence, Why Some Politicians Are More Dangerous Than Others, a Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year. He also co-authored The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, a New York Times bestseller. His advice has been sought out by President Clinton, Tony Blair, the World Health Organization, and the World Court. David A.J. Richards is also a professor of law at New York University. He is also the author of over 20 books, including Free Speech and the Politics of Identity, Disarming Manhood, Roots of Ethical Resistance, The Deepening Darkness, Patriarchy, Resistance, and Democracy's Future, and Why Love Leads to Justice, Love Across the Boundaries. To moderate tonight's conversation, we are also joined by Marcia, who teaches at New York University and held the Mercator Guest Professorship in the theology faculty at Humboldt University, Berlin, where she remains an annual guest professor. Some of her most recent books are From This Broken Hill I Sing to You, God, Sex, and Politics in the Work of Leonard Cohen, Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and Theologies of Relationality, and the New Evangelicals, Expanding the Vision of the Common Good. Professor Pally has also been a columnist and contributor to several U.S. and European periodicals. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and please order your copy of Holding a Mirror Up to Nature from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Let me begin.
Wait. Go, Jim.
When I first encountered Walter Manstein, a distinguished-looking man in his late 40s, he had just strangled his wife to death with the leash of her pet dog. He came into my orbit because he had been admitted to the prison psychiatric hospital, of which I was the medical director, for a pretrial psychiatric evaluation. As bizarre as his crime was, it was no more gruesome than the murders that had been committed by many of the other violent men I had seen. But Walter was a prominent and respected member of society, unlike most of the prisoners, a successful publisher in one of the largest cities in the state, the father of a daughter and the husband of a woman to whom he had been married for 20 years, and with whom, as he made clear, he had wanted to remain married until the night of the murder. When I first met him, I found it almost impossible to understand why, in God's name, a person whose prior behavior gave every evidence of strong moral character and psychological stability, and had so many advantages that it would seem he had everything to lose, would end his wife's life, ruin their daughter's life, and effectively end his own life as well. When I read the police report that accompanied him, the first thing I learned was that immediately after killing his wife, Walter had run out of the house and into his car, which he drove straight into a local reservoir in an attempt to drown himself. But the car did not completely submerge, and he climbed out of it and lay collapsed on the bank, where the police found and arrested him. He himself could say practically nothing to me, except to repeat over and over again that he was, quote, the greatest sinner who had ever lived, and that he expected to be executed by the state, which he felt he deserved. Indeed, he was frustrated by the fact that his attempt to kill himself had failed. So why had he done something so brutal to his wife and so irreversibly damaging and destructive to everyone else involved. When he became capable of talking coherently within the next few days, he revealed that he had committed this murder on the night of their 20th wedding anniversary. He had hoped that this anniversary would result in a restoration of closeness between himself and his wife, who he felt had become increasingly distant from him over the previous few years. He recalled that he had heard rumors and others had insinuated to him that she had attempted to persuade some of the businessmen whose advertisements he needed for the success of his publication to withdraw their support, though he couldn't understand why she would do this. But his hopes for a reconciliation were increasing as the evening went on, when she handed him a card to celebrate their anniversary. When he opened it, however, what he discovered was that she had crossed out the repeated phrase, "Love is this or that," and replaced it with "Love was." While he was still struggling with the implications of that emotional body blow, she capped it with the remark, "20 years, what a waste." Because he had allowed himself to imagine that she would love him and to hope for that outcome, he was doubly vulnerable to feelings of shame and humiliation over being so massively rejected. Shamed because of what she did, which was to reject him, but also shamed because of what he had done, which was to make himself vulnerable to her and depending on her by wanting her to love him, and foolish enough to expect that she could love him. When they went to bed that night, he said he did not merely feel crushed. He said, quote, "I was drowning in an ocean of hate." He could hardly sleep, and in the middle of the night, only half awake, he impulsively grabbed the leash of the pet dog she loved and strangled her to death with it. But immediately after doing so, he realized what he had done. He had killed the woman he had married and had loved at least enough to want her to love him in return. He could never bring her back to life. She was dead forever, and he had ruined the life of their daughter, who could never recover from the fact that her father had murdered her mother. To say merely that he felt guilty would be an understatement. He felt overwhelmingly guilty, the worst sinner who had ever lived, and felt the only thing he deserved was death and damnation. It was not he who ran to his car and drove it into the reservoir to drown himself. It was his guilt feelings that ran him to the car, drove it, and attempted to drown him. I was very familiar with Freud's notion that aggression is caused by an instinct, but that clearly did not explain this case or the others I was seeing. For instincts, to eat, to drink, to reproduce, are universal, whereas both murder and suicide are highly selective and relatively rare behaviors. I searched my mind for any way to understand how someone with so much to live for could do something so unthinkable. And then I realized I had just met Othello. That is why we are discussing a book about what Shakespeare has to tell us about the causes of violence and what we can do to understand it and hopefully prevent it.
I'm going to jump in, Jim, to tell you and David and our audience that when I read that passage, I have just met Othello. I thought, oh, I have just met the Proud Boys.
Yeah.
Now, my mind was running in this direction because I've just finished a book on populism, right-wing populism, and white evangelicals. And I thought the mechanism was so similar. Men who had felt shamed, ejected from the respected role they expected to have and fulfill, feeling a split suddenly between my shame and them who are ostensibly causing my sense of loss, threat, and humiliation, erupting in violence. In this case, group violence, political violence, but the mechanism of trigger was so parallel to my research on right-wing populism. And I noticed that later in your book, you also talk about political violence. You talk about Menelaus, you talk about Hitler, you talk about Vietnam, Osama bin Laden. And I wondered if you could elaborate on the bridge from the individual to the collective political and military violence.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly what I would like to talk about. I've used prisons as my, you might say, social psychological laboratory in which to learn whatever I could, as much as I could, about the causes and prevention of violence, in the same way that people studying physical illnesses like tuberculosis or AIDS or the COVID-19. In microbiology labs, they study what makes individual people experience this life-threatening pathology. But that in turn then is very helpful to us when we're trying to understand epidemics of tuberculosis or the pandemic of COVID-19, or what I would say are epidemics of violence, which we call wars and genocide and other collective forms of political violence. What I have been amazed by is the extent to which the motivations are the same, the only difference being that when people commit individual violence, like homicide or suicide, they generally are people who felt they were individually shamed by another individual. So they take out their rage on individual or try to escape their shame or undo their guilt by killing themselves. However, collective violence is caused when people feel that the group they identify with, whether it's a nation or a race or a religion, an ethnic group, has been shamed by another group. And then they want collectively to exert violence against the group that has shamed their group. And that's where we see Hitler, Osama bin Laden, Vladimir Putin today, and so on. They're dealing with what they experience as humiliation of their group by another group. Hitler blamed it on the Jews, but it really was the Western democracies in general. Osama bin Laden explained 9/11 by saying that that was payback for what he called 80 years of contempt and humiliation that he felt the entire Islamic nation had been subjected to by the Western world. Vladimir Putin has said that Russia was humiliated by the West after the Soviet Union imploded and collapsed, at the end of the Cold War. So he's trying to undo that humiliation by means of really just limitless violence.
Mm-hmm. This is precisely the work that I found in my work on populism that resonated so much with your analysis of Shakespeare, both of your analyses of Shakespeare. The experience of some kind of loss, it could be material loss, but then it triggers that sense of status loss, shame, being humiliated, and groups can undergo this as well as individuals, and they turn against the group. I want to bring David in, but this might be a moment to read a quote from the book that struck me so poignantly in light of the present geopolitical crisis and just as you said, the humiliation motivation for Putin, that it almost seems like a vanity war for him and his cadre to regain the valor that they think that they fairly deserve and that was taken away from them. And here's a quote from your book. In Hamlet, Shakespeare points out how absurd it is to go to war for the sake of honor, in which whole armies, quote, go to gain a little patch of ground that hath in it no profit but the name. and risking the lives of thousands of soldiers, quote, even for an eggshell, and to find quarrel in a straw when honor's at the stake.
It is simply remarkable. I mean, I think the importance of Jim's work in psychiatry is he really is one of the very first psychiatrists who actually did important research on violent people. Freud, for example, who identifies Eros as the great force in human life, which he certainly understood and advanced the understanding of through actual work with people. When it came to the question of aggression, he never did any work with violent people, the matter of homicide and suicide. And so he invented a mythological concept, thanatos, as though it's in the nature of things. Whereas I think Jim's work, which is, I think, deeply psychoanalytic and psychiatric, is that it isn't an instinct. Violence, it's the product of a certain culture and environment. And if it's a product of a culture and environment, there's no reason to despair in the way Freud does. It's perfectly understandable why he despaired, being a Jew in Venice, in Vienna, given what he was facing in this homicidal anti-Semitism. But he could not see, I think, what Jim's work enables you to see, that this is a cultural problem and can be addressed through culture and through trying to understand cultures, and which both elicit violence and give us a way of preventing it through reforming culture. So I think his work is absolutely path-breaking psychiatrically. What's amazing is that, to me, is that he only really came to see it when he was reading Shakespeare. I mean, and Shakespeare was for him a diagnostic tool. I mean, he found very little help, I think, in psychiatric categories. But by actually, because Shakespeare illuminated this both in the individual case, the various tragic heroes, including Othello and others, but also the endless leaders, Richard III, Henry V, who actually remind one of current political leaders. I mean, Richard III is a psychopath, really, and Henry V goes to, leads his people to an unjust war in France and advocates genocide. Shakespeare sees all this, and I think it's, to me, fascinating that it was through literature and through this remarkable artist who must have really been very sensitive to the violence in Elizabethan culture, which was certainly there. And it's through that Jim came to develop, I think, this quite path-breaking view of the roots of violence in experiences of humiliation.
Well, let me explain why David and I thought that it was so useful to use Shakespeare as our the person who gave us the case histories that we need in order to understand violence. Freud used to apologize that he said his case histories sounded so much like short stories, but he said that the nature of the subject demanded that you have to tell a person's life story to understand them. I would say that I'm using Shakespeare's plays as if they were case histories. I mean, I'm reversing what Freud did. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason I've done that is because, as I said, what I said about meeting Othello, I discovered that time after time, I met one character after another from Shakespeare's plays. I have met Macbeth. I have met Richard III. I mean, I've evaluated people who committed the same crimes for the same reasons that they did. As you have both alluded to, conventional psychiatry, mainstream psychiatry, has paid shockingly little attention to trying to understand the psychology of homicide and other forms of serious violence. For example, the current diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association says that suicide is something that is appropriate to receive psychiatric attention, regardless of whether you can attribute it to being caused by any particular mental illness or not. But they don't say a word about homicidal behavior. I mean, it is completely ignored. There are dozens of references in the index to suicidal behavior, not once does even the word homicide come up. Now, I think that is absurd. That's why I've devoted my life work primarily to trying to understand really all violence, homicide and suicide, individual and collective. And to me, the advantage of Shakespeare is he has given us in his plays the equivalent of case histories that are far more detailed and valid than any psychiatric case histories on this subject that I have ever seen anywhere. He takes us inside the minds of these murderers.
In the great soliloquies, for example.
Yes. And in everything they say. The soliloquies, yes, but often just throwaway lines. I mean, he time after time. For example, when I would ask violent criminals why they had committed a particular assault or even a murder, they would say because the person disrespected them. He disrespected me, or she did, and they use that term so often they abbreviated it into the slang term he or she dissed me. And it struck me that anytime people use a word so often they abbreviate it, it tells you something about how central it is in their moral and emotional vocabulary. And what was clear to me was that these are varieties of what I call shame and humiliation. Psychoanalysts call them narcissistic injuries, blows to a person's self-esteem when and there are many versions of this. The words that Shakespeare uses most often to describe the motivation for the murderers in his plays are words shame and honor, and actually dishonor, but the fear of losing their honor and needing to regain it by means of violence. But shame is a word he uses over and over and over again, describing those. That's what I discovered with the people I worked with, the murderers and other violent criminals in the prisons. Now, shame is so central to our emotional lives that we have probably 40 different words for it. I use shame as a generic word, like we use the word flower, to describe flowers. Well, we know there are a lot of different species of flowers, roses, tulips, daffodils, and so forth. Well, I'd say there are many different species of shame. The feeling of being disrespected, the feeling of being insulted, of being ridiculed, of being rejected.
Condescended to.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, you can think of, when people feel they're treated as if they're inferior, or they're insignificant, or they're not, important. These are all forms of feeling shamed. In Asian cultures, they talk about loss of face. That's shame.
Yeah. And this has come up so much, again, when I was researching and doing field work on populism, the sense of being condescended to, sidelined, marginalized, dismissed, being unheard, even being unheard and dismissed by your mainstream political representatives whose job it is to hear you. And the sense of rage and that us-them split that happens and becomes the mechanism for enraged outbursts.
Like January 6th, for example.
Yes,
It's a very clear illustration of this.
And the Charlottesville, 2017 Charlottesville, Virginia outpouring. There's two things that I found in my work that echoed just what you said, both of you. One is the sense of resentment and shame and humiliation, and they are very, very closely tied.
And I think the invention of scapegoats. I mean, always finding some absolutely innocent group of people. I mean, whether it's the Jews, the poor Ukrainians, you name it. I mean, American people of color after the Civil War. I mean, the search for scapegoats as a way of rationalizing what's real.
Yeah. So that goes back, Dave, to your point about its culture. every culture has, in an us-them split,
Yeah.
has a them or a menu of usual suspects, traditional thems, scapegoats that become the facilitated pathway for group rage and sometimes individual rage, just sometimes rage on the street.
Yeah, this is the distinction, very important in our book, and that Jim and I have tried to develop, named shame and guilt cultures. I mean, the culture of the Iliad is almost entirely a shame culture. It's thus incredibly violent. And then you see the transition. You can see it in Attic tragedy, the development of the beginnings of a guilt culture. And we think you can see the same thing in Shakespeare,
Yeah.
as the Elizabethans are moving from a violent feudal period to the Renaissance and the Reformation, the discovery of alternative modalities.
And even in individuals, one thing I think is so profound about Othello, Shakespeare's play, is he shows how Othello commits murder when he feels shamed because he has been deceived by Iago into thinking that his wife Desdemona has betrayed him by having sex with another man. So the shame motivates him to commit what we call an honor killing. He feels he's been dishonored, being made into a cuckold, a term that is only applied to men. They feel that because of the double standard in patriarchal rules of patriarchy, men feel especially dishonored or shamed if their wife has sex with somebody else. But then he realized actually she did love him, and he's killed an innocent person. And then he feels so guilty that he feels he needs to kill himself. So this is what I'm saying, is that shame primarily motivates anger and violence toward other people. Guilt promotes self-punishment. At a less extreme version, it's the acts of penance that we do. When people feel sinful in the church, they confess their sins and commit acts of penance, and then they're absolved of their guilt and their sinfulness.
Yeah.
So
is there productive? I notice in your book the wonderful elaboration of shame and guilt cultures. I also notice that both of you critique both, because shame promotes violence out, guilt often promotes violence in, and that can be by suicide, but it can be a lot of other bad things people do, drinking themselves, or substance abuse, and with both a critique of both shame and guilt cultures. Then what's the alternative?
I would say the alternative was what Shakespeare shows us in the plays like Measure for Measure, The Tempest, The Winter's Tale. The alternative to both shame and guilt is love. And that means the capacity to love both oneself and others. That is, to have enough self-esteem that you can emotionally afford to love others, and that you can but not feel guilty about your self-esteem. In guilt cultures, pride is regarded as the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. But if people can feel a healthy, normal sense of self-esteem, self-worth, self-respect, they're not going to be, they're not going to have a lot of violent impulses stimulated, so they have nothing to feel guilty about. And so I'd say it's what we need to learn if we want to prevent violence in our society and in our species, is how to create the conditions that are most conducive or most helpful to people in gaining the capacity to love, which I'd say is that's the capacity that makes you want to enhance the life of other people and yourself, and not take either. But Shakespeare shows us this. He shows that in, for example, Measure for Measure, it's about the Duke Vincentio leaves his city, and but spies on people. He disguises himself as a monk, And then he discovers that the person he's left as his deputy is about to commit the judicial murder of somebody for the most trivial of reasons. A man who's gotten his beloved pregnant, and he wants to marry her and is planning to marry her. And the Duke's deputy, who's running the place in his absence, is going to he's going to execute this guy. So the Duke, and then he also wants to rape the sister of the guy he's going to kill.
It's about to become a nun.
It was about to become a nun. So she's committed to chastity, and he wants to have sex with her, and he's really
exactly what he's condemning her brother for. Using
exactly.
It's a brilliant dramatization of the moral hypocrisy.
Absolutely. But then when Vincenzio comes back and reveals that he's been there all along and he knows what's happening, he does not punish anybody. He prevents everybody from harming anybody else. Nobody gets killed. Nobody gets sent to prison. What he does is he fosters their love for each other.
They end marriages.
The man who wanted to get married is
punishment in the play. It's marriage. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
one after another. But it was what we call restorative justice, not retributive justice. They are restored to the community.
Part of
they were alienated.
I think of our approach, and it's worth saying. I mean, the fact that here you have perhaps the most serious and profound student of violence that we have, and he crucially turned to literature, and it really does suggest that the sharp division in the human sciences between the hard sciences and literature is a shallow and stupid thing. That really literature plays a crucial role in the understanding of our species. I mean, this is something, Leonardo da Vinci saw, who was both a great scientist and a great artist. And I think the breaking down of these sterile disciplinary boundaries is really, I think, what enabled Jim to see what he sees. A better diagnosis of the problem of violence, and a beginning of a serious view of what would be the therapy for this, starting with these very violent men, but then moving out to the violence of political leaders and et cetera. I think it's a truly path-breaking approach to these issues, and it's still highly contemporary. I mean, there's plays are written, the tragedies run from roughly 1600 to 1608, right?
What I would say about Shakespeare is that he was the first psychologist in the modern world, by which I mean the post-medieval world. He was there right at the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern world of modern science and modern law and so forth.
In the same year as Galileo, as Jim always points out.
Yeah, they were born, he and Galileo were born in the same year.
And I thought that the second great psychologist of violence is Thomas Hobbes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And he said of himself, he was born the year of the Spanish Armada attack on England, and the legend has it that his mother, out of fright, went into labor, and that he was literally born of fear.
Yeah, he was absolutely feared man.
Yeah,
and Hobbes does something that Shakespeare, as I mentioned, does. He also examines shame, the psychology of shame, and he's a very acute psychologist about that. But I think I agree with both of you. But I think it's really studying these great authors from the past. We can learn things that we are not learning from a lot of our current writing, which often neglects these subjects. I've mentioned how psychiatry has neglected the study of homicidal violence, and but the same is true of the criminal justice system.
Yeah,
the criminal justice system does not even ask the question, what are the causes of this, defendant's murderous behavior, and what can we do to prevent that behavior, both in him and in people like him. The only questions the criminal justice system allows itself to ask and answer are, how evil was this person, and how much punishment does he deserve? Now, even if there were a way, an objective way to measure evil, the fact is it wouldn't help us in the least to understand what was causing the person to behave in the ways that we call evil. And I think there's also a mistaken assumption in the criminal justice system that punishment will prevent violence. On the contrary, I have seen over and over again that punishment, far from preventing violence or diminishing it and deterring it, punishment is the most powerful stimulus to violence that we have yet discovered. We know that in child rearing, the more severely children are punished, the more violent they become, both as children and as adults. The men that I saw in prisons had been punished as severely as you can punish somebody without actually killing them.
You think of solitary confinement.
Yeah. Well, even before that, in their childhoods,
Right.
most violent of these men were the survivors of their own attempted murder at the hand of a parent or another family member, or the survivors of their closest family members who had been murdered, often in front of their eyes. Now, they had been punished as severely as you can punish somebody without actually killing them. If punishment would prevent violence, these men would never have become violent in the first place, because you can't punish anybody any more than they've already been punished. But our criminal justice system makes the mistake of choosing retributive violence, which means punishment. But you know, the word punishment comes from Greek and Latin roots that mean revenge. Poine, the root of pain and punishment, was the Greek goddess of revenge. And we know that revenge is endless. Revenge only stimulates more counter revenge, and then counter revenge. You know, we have family feuds, you know, the Hatfields and the McCoys, or the Greeks versus the Trojans. I mean, these are family disputes.
Right.
And
it's also throughout, we have the same trilogies or generational in the Bible as well. Genesis is another great diagnostic tool.
It is.
If I may, I want to pivot and open up another area of discussion related to this. We've been talking primarily of men, and in the book you mention that, as you have this evening, that this is primarily a psychology of men. And I was wondering if we could consider a couple of things. For example, is the Medea character a female character who reacts to the shame of being rejected with violence? And second, if shame is being humiliated or fear of being humiliated for not having the opportunity to fulfill what one is supposed to fill, to be strong, to be virile, to be successful. Can women today be shamed or fear shame for not doing something that is now in the repertoire of women, not passing the test, not giving a good conference presentation, not writing a good legal brief or the best book, not playing a good game of tennis, etc. Now that these are within the purview of women, would you imagine the shame framework opening up in the female voice or arena?
Okay, those are really good questions. Let me begin by you mentioned the Medea. I want to say that the authors of the great tragedies, both the Greek tragedies like Medea or Shakespeare's tragedies, I would say we're only describing the kinds of behaviors that go on in real life.
They saw.
I have seen Medea, a woman whose husband became infatuated with another woman. And so like Medea, she killed their children. Unlike Medea, she then went on to kill herself eventually. But the point is, what I'm saying is, you're right. If you shame a woman enough, women can become as violent as men are. But you have to shame them a lot more, I'd say. And it's really more unusual and more discordant with the not only the psychological and social gender roles, or you might say sexual stereotypes. There are also, by the way, I'd say all human behavior has three causes: biological, psychological, and social. And there really is a lot of evidence that testosterone renders all mammalian males more violent than the females. Again, women can be, other mammal species, women can be violent to protect their children, but mostly it's the males that are more violent. With humans, I think the fortunate thing is, so far, our experience has been the more that women are involved in a social situation, the less violence there is. When I was running the prison mental hospital and mental health programs for the prisons as a whole, I tried to hire as many women as I could as the mental health professionals, because women, they neither stimulate as much violence, nor do they commit as much violence as men do. I mean, I've talked about how, yes, Walter Menstein's wife, you could say, provoked him, but that's not what most violence is. Most violence is men killing men. Both the perpetrators of murder, more than 80% are men. The victims of murder, more than 80% are men.
It's important to note that Shakespeare's plays certainly show that women are often deeply implicated and involved in patriarchy.
Yeah. Lady Macbeth.
That
But the difference is,
and also
Lady Macbeth has a great line in that play. She prays to the gods, "Unsex me."
Yes.
And make me not a woman. And I'd say the same thing about Volumnia, who's the mother of Coriolanus, another very violent character.
Really is trying to forge in her son into a warrior, so that at the end of the play, she doesn't care that he's going to die.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, David, is she doesn't commit the murders.
Yeah, yes.
She doesn't go out and kill people. She tries to get her son to do that. Lady Macbeth doesn't kill Duncan. She shames her husband into killing Duncan, the king. So
picking up on David's point, and also your point, Jim, that you just made, the role of culture. If culture changes and the role of women change in that culture, would you expect more female shame and therefore capacity for lashing out? Perhaps not in the identical way that men lash out, because one doesn't have to have identical forms. That's unnecessarily programmatic. But in other fashion, as a response to being shamed.
I would say it is more that they have voices of indignation, but I think women are more skeptical of violence.
Well, I'll tell you why. One reason I don't think that moves toward undoing male supremacy and sexism or misogyny is going to create more female violence. And that is because misogyny, male supremacy, is a characteristic of a shame culture. The more cultures become guilt cultures, the more they move toward equality rather than hierarchy. Shame cultures stimulate dictatorship as much as guilt cultures stimulate democracy. And I'd say that women's equality is a move toward democracy and away from shame culture. And that's why I think that the more that women are treated as equal to men, the less likely both men and women will be to commit violence. Medea committed violence because she was shamed. If women are less shamed,
why I asked the question.
Treated as equal, they will become less violent.
Yeah. So I also felt that Lady Macbeth may have felt shamed when Duncan doesn't choose Macbeth as his successor or right-hand man. And of course, in that society of the 16th century, she gets her husband and provokes him into. So she's using the that what I've said in some of my work, the manipulations of the powerless. If you don't have the societal standing to do it yourself, because you are powerless or of lesser power, you will figure out mechanisms and machinations to accomplish in this case, your response to shame.
Yeah.
There's a question that asks, I want to actually pull out two questions. You mentioned honor killings, and there's a question to elaborate just a little bit. And the other question is, was there anything that surprised you as you were writing this book?
Well, what surprised me is how explanatory the theory that Jim developed was. I mean, and how contemporary it was, frankly.
Yeah,
I
would, following on that, David, what I would say is what actually did surprise me was every single play I read, I realized I had seen that character. Yeah. I had seen Richard III. Remember that's the play. Richard III starts out the opening soliloquy in the whole play. He talks about how shamed and humiliated he feels because of his congenital anomaly, namely what they called a hunchback. And he felt that because he was his body was so deformed, he could not get any woman to love him. So he says, because I can't be a lover, I'll be a villain.
So he'll war on everyone.
So I saw Richard III in a murderer I evaluated. I did a psychiatric evaluation in Omaha, Nebraska. A man whose face he had literally lost face when he was playing as a child with a gasoline can and it blew up in his face and burned off most of the skin on his face. So he had lots of plastic surgery, but he still had a very deformed face. And he fell in love with a woman and wanted to get married to her, but she jilted him for another man. And like Richard III, he felt so humiliated by his deformity that he killed, he went into their house, he killed 2 people. Richard III killed more, but he killed as many as he could. And what I'm saying is Shakespeare got to these stories 4 centuries before I did. I mean, he saw them, and I'm sure he was describing what actually happened in real life. He wasn't making these things up.
The title of our book, it's a mirror up to nature. He really showed you how and it must have been very painful because what he shows you is horrible.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Lear is a play it's difficult to sit through. I mean, he shows you a son responsible for the blinding of a father who he hates.
I saw a murderer who did exactly. Edmund was the son who's humiliated. Starting again with the opening lines of the play King Lear, he's humiliated and by his father, and so he arranges in the course of the play to have his father's eyes gouged out. Well, that's such a horrible crime. The horrible form of violence.
And Shakespeare, unlike the Greeks, insists you see it.
Greeks, hard to imagine, really.
Shakespeare got to see it.
The person that I saw actually did that with somebody when he felt he'd been shamed, that he was called a wimp, a punk, and a pussy. He'd been bullied in high school, and he was with a girl who'd been a high school classmate of his a couple of years before. And he said he didn't like the way she was looking at me. And he just went berserk and carved out her eyes. I mean, this is unbelievably horrible to even think about. But Shakespeare describes that in King Lear. He shows exactly what the motive was. I mean, I saw Edmund, in one of the Massachusetts prisons.
Don't we see it when we see men throwing acid in the face of women who they think are not looking at, they didn't like the way they were looking with them, or not in the proper societal role of humility or passivity or sexual availability.
Sexual violence, it can be rooted in that kind of humiliation, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Humiliation, right?
You might say that
the ridiculous it is. I mean, they're stupid. Right.
I wanted to ask also another question about the therapy that you both describe in terms of talking, getting men to talk, to articulate, etc., of the work you have done on the individual level. And again, it made me think of my work on populism, where sometimes or often, words are used. A great many words are used, but often to bond the us and to foment, reinforce the rage against them, ostensibly responsible for our shame and humiliation. And so the use of language and words that you talk about can also be used actually to enhance the rage that results from shame, and then and to reinforce and build up this sense of us, them, and ironically provide an us that for the first time in life may feel supportive. You've got your guy, and they really are, and they really can be supportive.
That's the collective part. Hitler.
Yes, I am right.
Which was his main political argument, leading to him being elected in Germany. Right. So it has a enormous appeal.
Yeah.
Right. These guys are brilliant rhetoricians. You can see it in Richard III.
Yeah. Right.
One thing that I think is important to recognize about the relationship between shame and violence is that violence is a way of moving the shame away from oneself and onto one's victim. To assault or injure somebody is to humiliate them, to show you are more powerful than they are. And if you're afraid they're going to be laughing at you, you can stop them from laughing by making them cry instead, which is what violence does. It causes.
How about lynchings?
Absolutely.
Lynchings are a perfect example.
Of course.
And then when the white men felt shamed, they would undo the shame by utterly humiliating the black victims of lynchings. But the point of violence is to move the shame away from yourself and onto the victim, and to gain pride, the pride of saying, well, I am more powerful than that other person. And I'd also say violence is a way when people feel they can't get, I say, respect or admiration from others because of their positive contributions. What they look for is what I would call a kind of ersatz substitute for respect, which is fear. I've talked to violent criminals who said it was gratifying to them to see fear in the eyes of their victim. That's the closest they can get to respect. They couldn't gain real respect because they didn't have the capacity for constructive contributions to other people's lives, but they could always make them afraid.
So I see you, as you were talking 10 seconds ago, I thought Putin, he had the capacity to gain real respect by building up an economy, by utilizing the natural resources to parlay into an integration with the European Union and the West, as well as China, and to enhance education and the economy and build up an infrastructure that would truly garner him and earn him respect. And yet the choice taken. And so could you talk about why the, for lack of a better word, productive road to respect is eschewed and the us, them, shame-driven road is taken?
I think that there's a basic lack of self-confidence or feeling of self-esteem that lies. If people, when people realize they can gain admiration and respect from other people for making positive contributions to their lives or their societies, they will always choose that. People resort to violence only when they don't think they have the capacity to achieve a positive outcome, and I think that's true. I think that's true of Putin, as of most other dictators. What I would say about using violence as a way to undo shame, in the long run, it really does not work. It's like drinking salt water to quench your thirst.
Yeah.
And
So-
Macbeth illustrates that. You know, by the time of the, you know, he starts off with a little, he kills one person. Well, so he started drinking salt water. Eventually, he drowns in salt water.
Yeah, Macbeth can't stop himself, and
Yeah.
you know, his wife stands by and says, "What have I done?" She
Yeah.
can't stop him, and she ends up, you know, essentially committing suicide.
Yeah.
Guilt, because she realizes, "What have I done? I've unleashed this. I can't stop it."
Or think of Hitler. I mean, and Mussolini. I mean, both of them. Hitler killed himself. Mussolini was killed, you know, brutally by and appropriately by the people against him. When you and the same happened with Macbeth and Richard III and so on. I mean, because one thing about being violent is it stimulates revenge from the people that you're being violent against, or if nothing else, self-defense. If you're going to be violent, people will try to defend themselves against you, and that may mean they'll have to kill you. So I mean, that's why shame is a grossly pathological and self-defeating way of trying to undo shame and gain honor. And I think we're seeing that with Putin. It's just that cannot end in anything but disaster.
What I heard from my colleagues close to that part of the world immediately was the following sentence: "It's hard to see how this will end."
Yeah,
Because I understood that Putin is motivated by the structure that the two of you have described. And then how do you back out of that? What is the face-saving way to back out of where he has gotten himself now?
You know, sometimes with an individual murderer, there is such a thing that you could say too late. When sometimes, you know, physicians cannot cure every illness. I mean, some people have terminal illnesses that just cannot be healed. And I think sometimes that's true. When people have crossed a certain line, it may be that there's no way back that they will find. Ideally, yes, what you referred to, I think, would be a positive solution. If one could find a face-saving way, that certainly would be the solution, something that Putin could accept without feeling he'd been unduly humiliated. And I think that that's the job of ambassadors and of you know, discussions of that sort. But sometimes it's true. Well, for example, on an individual scale, you can have a mass murderer who's shooting everybody in sight. You know, you can't prevent that by saying, "Gee, wouldn't you like to see a psychotherapist?" You have to shoot the person. You may have to kill the mass murderer. That's the only way to stop people from killing other people, and that's a tragic dilemma. But it's one that we sometimes have to contend with.
I think this is one of the things, to respond to your earlier question, Marcia. What really surprised me about Jim's work is with these very violent men, violence replaces their voice. What he found, I mean, what Jim essentially did is he listened to them. No one had ever listened to their stories. And when they actually began telling these horrifying stories, there was a process. I mean, Freud said analysis is a therapy through love. And I think Jim had a capacity to actually listen and attend to these. Everyone loves to hate criminals.
But, you know, I could also mention
I do think
something we did, I've done in this country, in England, in many places, is to have violent youth and adults perform plays of Shakespeare.
Yeah, in England, here.
People who said, this gave me a language that I didn't realize existed. They didn't realize words could, in fact, be so powerful that they could express so much in the way of their feelings and their goals and their values.
So you've answered my question a moment ago about what kind of language, what kind of words, because I'm sort of drowning right now in the use of language for right-wing populism
Sure.
to reinforce the us-them rage.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the use of language enabling the men you're talking with to find a voice through these. They're not going to find on their own spontaneously because of damage, so they find it through the plays given to them, and that's a very different use of language than the language used to reinforce the shamed us that is rightfully entitled to violate them.
Yes.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, there was one comment that this is the way Shakespeare should be taught in high school.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And they should read our book. I mean,
Absolutely.
really bring it alive as it has brought us alive.
Right. And just on that note, I'll mention to our listeners that there is a green bar at the bottom of the screen, I think, which you can click and actually buy the book from this bookstore who so graciously hosted this discussion.
And there's also a website that we have called understandingviolence.org, where you can see much more about the book and about us. And if you want to contact us to have further.
Can they do that through the website, understandingviolence.org?
If people have questions or want to make comments, we would be glad to receive them on our website and respond to them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you all.
And thanks to the Books and Books bookstore.
And
Thank you three for this conversation tonight, and thank you everyone who joined. And don't forget that you can purchase this copy of the book from our store, in stores or on our website. And in the chat, there's understandingviolence.org again if you want to contact them and learn more about the book. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.